In late 1935, New Jersey's Democrats began casting around for a candidate to run for United States Senator, and my name started cropping up in political columns. This speculation led to the one and only time that Frank Hague, the perennial mayor of Jersey City and New Jersey Democratic boss, was in my home in Llewellyn Park, West Orange. Hague used that occasion to corner me outside the earshot of others to offer me the Democratic nomination for the United States Senate. Even after I explained to him why I chose not to be a candidate, Hague persisted, and with his extended finger tattooing my chest, he said, "This is Frank Hague asking you. Me, Frank Hague. People don't say no to me."
This confrontation between Jersey City Mayor Frank Hague and Charles Edison, son of the famous inventor, in this suburban mansion symbolizes a major shift in political power in modern New Jersey. In the early 1900s, an uneasy coalition of rural Republicans and urban Democrats controlled state politics. By the second half of the 20th century, political power had shifted to the suburbs. New Jersey was becoming the suburban state.
In the decade before the American Civil War, the world's first picturesque suburb was developed in the eastern foothills of New Jersey's Orange Mountains. Heavily wooded, with rolling hills and clear streams, Llewellyn Park afforded a spectacular view of Manhattan, and yet was only 13 rail miles from New York City over the new Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. In 1852, Llewellyn S. Haskell, a prosperous drug merchant, began purchasing property in West Orange. He added land every year, until by 1856, he and 8 partners owned 400 acres, mostly on the south slope of a mountain. Haskell propitiously selected Alexander Jackson Davis to prepare his site plan. The son of the editor of a Protestant review in New York City, Davis was the most prolific architect of his generation. Llewellyn Park introduced 2 features that were unprecedented in modern residential experience. It was the first to incorporate purposefully undulating roads for an entire community. The second innovative design feature was its 50-acre ramble, located at the center of the suburb, intended as a completely natural open area without any formal layout except pedestrian walkways which curved through the woods and connected with the cliff walk along the ridge of the mountain. The ramble followed a tumbling stream. Alexander Jackson Davis moved there after his retirement, and the inventor Thomas Alva Edison made it his home for most of his active life. Llewellyn Park, then as now, provided an environment free from the nuisances of congestion, industry, and poverty, which were, of course, characteristic of inner-city life. Most importantly, Llewellyn Park introduced to landscape architecture the notion that a beautiful natural setting could be created for a group rather than an individual family. Llewellyn Park thus began the tradition of carefully planned suburbs that was to be a central concern of American architects in the 20th century.
Commuting appealed especially to those who felt that mountain air was a curative easing the pain of the tired feeling at the end of a busy day in a city office. This induced swelling numbers of businessmen to patronize the Morris and Essex Railroad, later known as the Delaware, Lackawanna and Western, or just the Lackawanna. The tracks of the Lackawanna snaked their way in sweeping curves through the Oranges, Milburn, and Short Hills, up to Summit, and then moved westward through Chatham, Madison, and Morristown. So many top executives lived in Madison, Convent, and Morristown that the railroad started its famed Bankers Express in 1883. Counting the ferryboat ride across the Hudson River, Bankers Express riders could get from Morristown to New York in 50 minutes.
By the second decade of the 20th century, the Port of New York, although still the busiest in the world, was entering a period of decline. Its problems became evident during World War I, when freight trains destined for New York backed up as far as Pennsylvania because of congestion and overcrowding in the Great Harbor. 90% of the docking facilities were located in New York City, but most of the railroads terminated in New Jersey. So boxcars had to be loaded on and off barges, which then shuffle back and forth across the Hudson River and New York Bay. In response to these and related problems, the states of New York and New Jersey undertook a cooperative effort to create an institution unlike anything ever before seen in the United States. To be known as the Port of New York Authority, it would improve terminals and associated transportation facilities throughout this great harbor and be empowered to issue bonds and to charge fees for its services.
The Port of New York Authority saw the light of day in April 1921. Created at the urging of business and political leaders on both sides of the Hudson, the Port Authority would, its founders hoped, replace conflict with cooperative effort in the region's search for growth on and near its 800 miles of waterfront.
In the 3 decades following its founding, the agency steadily broadened its mission, expanding from rail freight planning to become the nation's first multi-purpose regional authority.
The new agency was given a very general mission to enhance cooperative planning in the bi-state region, and a specific mandate to develop and implement a plan to improve the region's rail freight system. But it was provided with very little power or funds to carry out that plan. For 10 years, the agency struggled to win over the rail officials to its preferred program, but by 1931, no real progress had been made toward that goal, and the comprehensive railroad scheme was essentially abandoned. As automobiles and trucks challenged railroad dominance in freight and passenger transport, the Port Authority reached out and took a leading role in improving each new facet of the region's transport system. These new ventures would soon stamp it as a leading player in the automotive age.
One of the authority's first projects, the George Washington Bridge, opened northeastern New Jersey to a wave of suburbanization by New York office workers in the late 1920s. The Lincoln and Holland tunnels also contributed to the westward search for homes in the years before and after World War II.
Although the motor car was the quintessential private instrument, its owners had to operate it over public spaces. A massive investment in roadways was necessary because city streets at the beginning of the 20th century were notoriously dilapidated and rutted. By the 1920s, a coalition of private pressure groups, including tire manufacturers and dealers, part suppliers, oil companies, service station owners, road builders, and land developers, were lobbying for new streets. As the suburbs drew off the wealthy, central cities became identified with social problems. Newark offers a good example of this trend. In the 19th century, the New Jersey metropolis was one of America's leading industrial centers. Its heavy industries, its whirring factories, its prosperous building trades, and its noted public works made Newark a confident and optimistic community. Like every other large city, Newark sought to annex its suburbs, and its leaders confidently expected that New Jersey's largest city would do just that and follow the example set by many other metropolitan areas. Yet the suburban trend was already draining away Newark's most successful and prosperous citizens. The city increasingly became the home of poor minorities. Perceptive observers realized as early as the 1930s that the future of Newark was bleak. The fact that the peripheral neighborhoods had then, and usually have now, the legal status of separate communities has given them the capacity to zone out the poor, to refuse public housing, and to resist the integrative forces of the modern metropolis. Thus, the problems of the core neighborhoods are usually more serious than those of the adjacent suburbs. No agency of the United States government had a more pervasive and powerful impact on the American people in the 20th century than the Federal Housing Administration. It was created in 1934 and was intended to encourage improvement in housing standards and conditions, to facilitate sound home financing on reasonable terms, and to exert a stabilizing influence on the mortgage market. The primary purpose, however, was the alleviation of unemployment, which stood at about a quarter of the total workforce in 1934, and which was particularly high in the construction industry. The FHA effort was later supplemented in 1944 by the GI Bill, which created the Veterans Administration to help the 16 million American veterans of World War II to purchase a home. Reflecting the prevailing racial attitudes of the 1930s and 1940s, the FHA was concerned with inharmonious racial or nationality groups, meaning in New Jersey, especially African Americans. The FHA feared that an entire neighborhood could lose its housing values if rigid white-black separation and segregation were not maintained. Its neighborhood appraisals were influential in determining where it would be reasonably safe to insure mortgages. The result was suburban favoritism. Whole areas of cities were declared ineligible for loan guarantees. As late as 1966, for example, the FHA did not have a single home mortgage in either Camden, New Jersey, or Paterson, New Jersey, both of them declining industrial cities. So for perhaps the first time in American history, the federal government embraced the discriminatory attitudes of the marketplace. Previously, prejudices had been personal and individual. Now, however, the FHA was endorsing segregation and enshrining it as public policy.
Only in the most ambitious suburban tracts built after the war did developers incorporate retail stores into their plans. Most new suburban home developers made no effort to provide for residents' commercial needs. Not until the mid-1950s did a new market structure appropriate to this suburbanized mass consumption society prevail. Commercial developers, many of whom owned department stores, began constructing a new kind of marketplace, the regional shopping center, aimed at satisfying suburbanites' consumption and community needs.
Strategically located at highway intersections or along the busiest thoroughfares, the regional shopping center attracted patrons living within half an hour's drive who would come by car, park in the abundant lots provided, and then proceed on foot.
Here was the new city of the post-war era, a vision of how community space should be constructed in an economy and a society built on mass consumption. Garden State Plaza and Bergen Mall, both located in Paramus, New Jersey, provide good models of shopping centers in the 1950s. As central sites of consumption, they offered the full range of businesses and services that one would previously have sought downtown. Recreational facilities range from a 550-seat movie theater, a bowling alley, and an ice skating rink, to a children's gymnasium and a playground. When developers and store owners set out to make the privately owned shopping center a more perfect downtown, they aimed to exclude from this public space unwanted urban groups such as vagrants, prostitutes, racial minorities, and poor people. Developers deliberately defined their communities through a combination of marketing and policing. Store selection, merchandise, prices, and carefully controlled access to suburban shopping centers supported a class and a color line. Although bus service was available for shoppers without cars, only a tiny proportion arrived that way. Bus routes were carefully planned to serve non-driving customers, particularly women, from neighboring suburbs, not low-income consumers from cities such as Passaic, Patterson, and Newark. By the 1960s, the mass consumption economy had brought about a major restructuring of consumer markets. As retail dollars moved out of major cities and away from established downtowns within suburban areas, regional shopping centers became the distinctive public space of the post-war landscape. Not by accident, public space in the suburbs, like the shopping center, was restructured and segmented by class and race, just as African Americans gained new protections for their right of equal access to public accommodations. At the same time that African Americans and their supporters were prodding courts and legislatures to eliminate legal segregation in public places, real estate developers, retailers, and consumers were collaborating to shift economic resources to new kinds of privately owned, segregated spaces. The landscape of mass consumption created a metropolitan society in which people were no longer brought together in central marketplaces and the parks, the streets, and the public buildings that surrounded them, but rather were separated by class, by gender, and by race in differentiated commercial subcenters. Meanwhile, Newark, once the largest shopping district in the state, saw every one of its major department stores close between 1964 and 1992, and much of its retail space remains abandoned.
Suburban voters, their numbers now inflated by the flight from cities within the state and on its borders, suddenly found themselves at the center of state politics. Under this new system, the battle lines in the 1970s were drawn between a strong state Supreme Court interpreting a revised state constitution versus a governor and legislature increasingly responsive to a predominantly suburban constituency. The two big issues were school funding and exclusionary zoning. Like other states, New Jersey has relied on local property taxes to fund its public schools. Also, like other states, New Jersey's Supreme Court has ordered that a more equitable system of financing the schools be determined because of the inequalities between urban and suburban tax bases. The issue came before the New Jersey Supreme Court in the case of Robinson v. Cahill. In 1970, a suit was filed on behalf of Kenneth Robinson, a sixth-grade student in Jersey City's public schools, that the reliance on property taxes to finance the public schools violated the clause in the New Jersey State Constitution guaranteeing a thorough and efficient education to every New Jersey student. In April 1973, the state Supreme Court ruled that while the quality of educational opportunity does not necessarily depend on the amount of money invested, the state had to define what a thorough and efficient education meant and to devise a more equitable means to fund it. It wasn't until July 1975 that the legislature finally passed the Public School Education Act, which provided a new state formula for funding public education. However, the legislature failed to provide an appropriation to fund the legislation. In July 1976, an irate Supreme Court ordered the closing of all public schools. A few weeks later, the legislature reluctantly passed the state income tax. A constitutional amendment specified that all revenues from the new income tax were to be applied only to property tax relief in the form of the state assuming a larger proportion of the costs of the public schools. In 1981, Marilyn Morehouser, executive director of the Educational Law Center in Newark, filed a new lawsuit arguing that the school funding mechanism continued inequalities between the property-rich suburban schools and the property-poor urban schools. The case became known as Abbott v. Burke, after 12-year-old Raymond Abbott of East Orange, whose name led the list of students alphabetically, and the New Jersey Commissioner of Education, Fred Burke. The case came before the New Jersey Supreme Court again. The court declared in June 1990 that 28 of the state's poorest school districts must be brought up to the funding level of the state's wealthiest districts. Meanwhile, Democratic Governor Jim Florio had pushed through the legislature the Quality Education Act. It increased state taxes by $2.8 billion, with $1.4 billion being dedicated to school aid and property tax relief. The Quality Education Act was pushed through the legislature in 22 days and passed in June 1990 with no Republican support. As a result, dissatisfaction was directed not at the court, but at the Democratic governor and legislature. The other issue that pitted the suburbs against the cities was exclusionary zoning. The power of municipalities to regulate land use is a relatively recent development. In New Jersey, zoning only came about as a result of a constitutional amendment in 1927 following a 1926 United States Supreme Court decision. In 1972, the Camden Legal Services, on behalf of the Southern Burlington County chapter of the NAACP, sued the township of Mount Laurel on the grounds that its zoning ordinance illegally excluded the poor, the young, and the old. The ordinance allowed for only one type of residence: single-family, detached houses on relatively large plots of land. Located about 7 miles from Camden and 10 miles from Philadelphia, Mount Laurel had been primarily a rural agricultural area in 1950. The completion of the New Jersey Turnpike and later Interstate I-295 spurred suburban development in the township. The motivation for exclusionary zoning was deeply embedded in suburban development. The residents of these communities feared that higher density development would require additional schools, roads, sewers, and other services, all of which would increase local taxes. Furthermore, many of the people who have settled in the suburbs were fleeing the problems of the cities, especially high taxes and crime. The case made its way to the New Jersey Supreme Court, which decided in 1975 that the Mount Laurel restrictions violated the constitutional guarantee of due process and equal protection of the laws. The court was careful to limit the case only to developing suburban communities like Mount Laurel and to regional housing needs. The court offered no particular remedy or method of enforcing its decision. Many suburban municipalities used delaying tactics to avoid implementation of the Mount Laurel decision, and others were dragged into court. Finally, in 1983, the New Jersey Supreme Court addressed the issue again in what has become known as the Mount Laurel II decision. Mount Laurel II's assault on home rule produced howls of outrage from the suburbs. Republican Governor Tom Kean said he would not act on the decision until the legislature produced an appropriate statute. The Fair Housing Act of 1985 established a Council on Affordable Housing to determine and adjudicate municipal housing obligations. But it also allowed municipalities to buy out half of their Mount Laurel obligations by subsidizing low-cost housing elsewhere in the state, presumably in the cities. The legislation thereby shifted the issue from banning exclusionary zoning to providing affordable housing. The Fair Housing Act greatly reduced the number of mandated affordable housing units. It also moved many of them out of the suburbs and back into the cities. However, it did produce some units that would not have otherwise been built and converted suburban outrage to grudging acceptance. State government increasingly served the political and economic interests of the new suburban majority. The old rural-urban political coalition had given little attention to the suburbs. The new suburban regime would give little attention to the cities.